It started on an ordinary morning in a quiet suburban neighborhood, the kind of place where everyone waved hello to each other, where the rhythm of life seemed calm and predictable. But beneath that calm surface, shadows lingered, shadows that preyed on trust, on kindness, on vulnerability. For most residents, these shadows were invisible, slipping through doors like whispers. But for one tenant, the shadows were about to be illuminated. Jard had lived in the small apartment building for nearly 5 years. On the surface, he was unremarkable, a quiet man who kept to himself, paid his rent on time, and had a soft spot for Mrs. Carmichael, the elderly woman who lived across the hall. But Jard had noticed something unusual. Over the past few months, he had seen people lurking around, asking questions that didn't seem innocent, trying to gain access to apartments under vague pretenses. At first, he dismissed it as random strangers, but then Mrs. Carmichael received a phone call that made her tremble. She said they were from the city, Mrs. Carmichael told him one afternoon, her hands shaking as she clutched her teacup. They said they needed to check my water lines to make sure everything was safe and that I had to pay a fee immediately or they'd shut off my utilities. Jard felt a cold knot tighten in his stomach. This wasn't the first time he'd heard of scams targeting the elderly. But it was personal now because Mrs. Carmichael had always been like a grandmother to him, a gentle, trusting woman who baked cookies and handed him little gifts when he came home late. The thought of her falling victim to these con artists made his blood boil. That night, Jard couldn't sleep. His mind raced with what he knew: these scammers were clever, patient, and relentless. They didn't just target money, they targeted dignity, independence, and the quiet comfort of a home. And if they succeeded, people like Mrs. Carmichael would be left shaken, humiliated, and financially ruined. By morning, he had made a decision. He would do something most people wouldn't dare. He would turn the tables. He would pretend to be the landlord himself and draw these predators into a trap. The plan was risky. If he was caught, he could face legal consequences. But the thought of the elderly being safe was worth every ounce of risk. Jard began his preparations meticulously. He studied the building's records, memorized names, and even created a fake landlord identity, complete with an official-sounding business card and a phone number that routed directly to him. He learned the scripts scammers used, the urgency, the threats, the false claims. Every detail mattered. The more he knew, the more convincing he could be. Days passed, nothing happened. And then late one Tuesday afternoon, his moment came. A man in his 30s, dressed in a nondescript blue uniform, knocked on the building's front door. He carried a clipboard and a casual, confident smile, the kind of smile meant to disarm and distract. Jard watched from behind a curtain as the man spoke with Mrs. Carmichael. The voice was smooth, rehearsed. Jard's heart pounded. He called out in his landlord voice, sharp but calm, "Excuse me, sir, can I help you?" The man turned, startled. Yes, I'm here for an inspection." "I'm the landlord," Jard interrupted, stepping into the foyer. "I handle all inspections personally. May I see your identification?" The man's smile faltered, subtle at first, then more noticeably. I left it in the car," he stammered. "That's fine," Jard said, holding his phone up. "I've been keeping track of who's been asking residents about their utilities. I need your name and the company you represent." The man hesitated, and in that hesitation Jard could see the tension building, the first crack in the armor of a scammer who thought he was untouchable. The man muttered something vague about being from a city agency and began to step back. Jard's voice was steady but firm. "I can't allow anyone into this building without proper verification. If you insist, I will have to call the authorities." At that moment, the man's confidence completely unraveled. He realized he had miscalculated. Jard, the quiet tenant who had never drawn attention, was not someone to underestimate. I'll come back later," the man muttered, retreating to the sidewalk. He disappeared before Jard could call the police, but the encounter left a mark. Jard knew this wasn't just one isolated incident. The scammers were bold, patient, and organized, and now he had their attention. The next days were a tense game of cat and mouse. Jard set up cameras in the common areas, tracked suspicious calls, and even left subtle hints in the building's hallways, like reminders that security cameras were monitoring visitors. He was careful not to alert the scammers directly, but he wanted them to feel observed, watched. Then came the breakthrough. One evening, as Jard reviewed the security footage, he saw two men in hoodies approaching Mrs. Carmichael's door. They knocked politely, carrying what appeared to be an official-looking envelope. Jard's pulse quickened. He dialed the landlord number, pretending to call from a city office. "Good evening," he said into the phone, his voice calm but authoritative. "I see you're attempting an unauthorized entry into my tenant's apartment. I suggest you step back immediately." The men froze, exchanging glances. Then, in a move that surprised even Jard, they backed away as if realizing the walls themselves were closing in on them. But instead of fleeing entirely, they lingered across the street, trying to figure out who was watching. Jard could feel the tension like electricity in the air. He realized then that the game was changing. The scammers were no longer random opportunists, they were predators with a plan, and they were sizing him up, testing him. Every move Jard made would now be a step in a delicate dance of deception. One wrong move and they could vanish with Mrs. Carmichael's trust and potentially her savings. Over the next week, Jard escalated his efforts. He began pretending to inspect other apartments, walking through hallways with a clipboard, taking notes, making phone calls from his landlord persona. He left small notes for residents. Please report any suspicious activity immediately. Some neighbors were curious, some skeptical, but none knew the true reason behind Jard's sudden vigilance. One afternoon, as Jard returned from a fake inspection, he overheard whispers in the lobby. Two new men, unfamiliar faces, were asking questions about the building's security systems. Their eyes darted toward the stairwell cameras, the locked doors, the intercom. They were trying to figure out if this was a soft target. Jard's stomach tight. These were not amateurs. They were the kind who had probably scammed hundreds, moving from neighborhood to neighborhood. Hunting the most vulnerable. He decided it was time for the next phase, setting a trap, not just chasing shadows. He contacted a local retired police officer he knew, explaining the situation without revealing the full danger. The officer agreed to consult and provide advice, turning what was initially a personal mission into a carefully coordinated operation. That night, Jard could hardly sleep. He went through every scenario, imagining how the scammers would approach, how they would react, and how he could outsmart them without endangering Mrs. Carmichael or anyone else. The house was silent, the only sound the occasional creak of the floorboards, yet in that silence he felt the presence of unseen eyes, those of the predators watching, waiting. Morning brought no relief. Jard dressed quickly, checking the front entrance cameras one last time. There on the sidewalk were the two hooded men again. They were circling, packing, speaking quietly into what looked like small radios. The realization hit him hard. This was more than a scam attempt. This was an organized operation, and he was standing in their path. Jard took a deep breath, trying to steady the adrenaline surging through his veins. He adjusted his landlord badge and stepped into the lobby, smiling politely but with a firmness that brooked no nonsense. As he approached, the men froze, their confidence waning. Jard could see the recognition in their eyes. They knew they were being challenged, exposed in a way they hadn't anticipated. "Can I help you, gentlemen?" he asked calmly, clipboard in hand, pen poised. The silence stretched, then one of the men cleared his throat. We just wanted to check something," he said, voice trembling slightly. Jard's eyes narrowed. "I need your credentials now." The man fumbled, producing a fake ID that looked unconvincing under Jard's scrutinizing gaze. That was the moment Jard had been waiting for, a clear, undeniable sign of deception. As the men stumbled backward, Jard could feel the tension in the air like a taut wire. This was it, the confrontation, the turning point. He spoke with the calm authority of someone who had prepared for this moment for weeks. "You're not welcome here," he said. "Leave now, or I will call the police and provide all evidence of your attempt to defraud my tenants." The men exchanged one last glance, a mix of fear and frustration, then bolted down the street, disappearing into the shadows from which they had emerged. Jard stood there, heart hammering, the adrenaline slowly fatting. He felt a surge of relief, but it was short-lived. This wasn't the end. It was only the beginning. Because somewhere out there, more of them were watching, learning, adapting. And Jard knew that the safety of the most vulnerable depended on his next moves. And so, with the city returning to its usual quiet rhythm, Jard prepared for the next chapter of the battle, one where the predator might think they were in control, but the tenant had already become the most unexpected force in the game. The first trap had worked, but the story was far from over. The city woke slowly that morning, sunlight creeping through the blinds and casting long, angular shadows across Jard's apartment. Yet for him there was no sense of calm, no comfort in the ordinary rhythms of life. The previous day's encounter with the scammers had left him both exhilarated and wary. He knew they had seen him as more than just a tenant. They had glimpsed a force they hadn't anticipated. And now the question loomed: how far would they go to reclaim control? Jard spent the morning reviewing footage from his security cameras. Every movement, every hesitation of the scammers the day before was recorded in meticulous detail. He noticed subtle patterns, the way they approached the building, how they spoke quietly into radios, the split-second glances toward exit routes. Each detail was a clue. Each clue was a piece of the puzzle he had vowed to solve. He also began a quieter, more strategic operation. Jard started reaching out to his neighbors, gently asking if they had noticed anything unusual, solicitors, strange calls, or visits from anyone claiming authority. Most dismissed his inquiries, assuming it was just curiosity or the harmless vigilance of a conscientious tenant. But a few elderly residents, hesitant at first, began to open up. One woman mentioned someone asking about her bank deposits. Another spoke of a man offering urgent repairs for a fee she hadn't agreed to. It was becoming clear that this was no random act. Someone or a group was systematically targeting the building, probing for weaknesses and testing who could be easily manipulated. The pattern alarmed Jard, but it also fueled his resolve. He decided it was time to escalate the deception. His next step was audacious. He would set up a sting, a carefully orchestrated trap to catch the scammers in the act, but it had to be convincing. Too blunt and they would flee, too subtle and they would continue their predatory work unnoticed. He spent hours designing the plan, imagining every possible reaction and rehearsing his landlord persona until it became instinctive. The trap relied on two key elements: the illusion of vulnerability and the promise of reward. Jard posted a note in the lobby, intentionally vague, hinting at a resident who had large sums of cash stored for emergency repairs. The note was visible but cryptic, just enough to pique curiosity without revealing specifics. Simultaneously, he arranged a dummy apartment setup, an empty unit staged with personal belongings, fake documents, and an envelope labeled urgent funds. By late afternoon, everything was in place. Jard hid in plain sight, observing from his apartment window, ready to intercept anyone who approached the dummy apartment. His heart raced as he spotted movement across the street. Two men, hooded and cautious, packing back and forth. They stopped periodically, as if confirming their approach and timing. The first instinct he felt was fear, an entirely natural response, but it was quickly replaced with a calm, calculated focus. When the men finally approached the building, Jard's voice echoed from the foyer, crisp and authoritative. "Excuse me, I need to see your identification before anyone enters." The two men froze. One shifted nervously, scanning the lobby. The other, slightly taller, muttered something under his breath. Their reactions mirrored those from the day before, but this time Jard had additional leverage, the knowledge that cameras captured every move and that every entry point in the building was being monitored. The taller man stepped forward, feigning confidence. "We're just here to deliver documents," he said, holding up a plain folder. Jard studied them silently, his mind running through every possible angle. "I need the name of your company, a contact number, and a badge. I'm required to verify anyone entering the building." The shorter man stammered, "Oh, we left the badge in the car, paperwork somewhere." Jard's eyes narrowed. The hesitation, the vagueness, it was a tell. These were not professionals with legitimate business, these were opportunists, predators exploiting trust. He decided to escalate, but carefully. "I'm recording this interaction," he said, gesturing to the cameras and holding his phone in view. "I will contact authorities immediately if this situation is not resolved. You cannot enter without proper verification." A tense silence followed. The taller man whispered something to the other and they exchanged glances filled with uncertainty and frustration. It was clear that they had not expected resistance of this caliber. Jard maintained his composure, though his pulse was hammering. The power of presence, of control, was now firmly in his hands. Then, in an unexpected move, the taller man tried a diversion. "Listen," he said smoothly, "we're here for an emergency. There's a safety hazard, maybe a gas leak in one of the units. We just want to check." Jard interrupted, calm but unwavering. "You've already demonstrated deception. Any further attempt to mislead me will be documented and authorities will be involved immediately. Step back now." The men hesitated. Then, in a sudden, almost imperceptible nod, they retreated down the street, disappearing around the corner as silently as they had appeared. Jard exhaled slowly, but the relief was fleeting. He knew that this confrontation was only the opening act. Over the next few days, Jard became even more vigilant. He doubled his patrols of the building, coordinated with neighbors to report unusual activity, and even installed temporary decoys, fake packages, staged conversations, and false indications of wealth within the apartments. The message was clear: anyone attempting deception would face consequences. But as the week wore on, Jard began noticing a new pattern, something more subtle, more insidious. The scammers were adapting, watching his tactics, testing boundaries from a distance. They had not been defeated, they had merely regrouped. And then came the message, a letter slipped under the door of his apartment, unsigned, with a single line: "We know you're watching, we're coming back." The words sent a chill down his spine. It was one thing to face opportunists in person, it was another to realize that someone was actively monitoring him, calculating his every move, learning from his strategy. The letter was more than a threat, it was a promise of escalation, and it turned his careful game into a high-stakes battle. Jard consulted with the retired police officer again, detailing the letter and the surveillance footage. The officer, a man who had seen the darkest sides of human nature over decades, listened carefully. "These are organized predators," he said gravely. "They're not just after money, they're after fear. You've made yourself a target by challenging them." The gravity of the situation sank in. Jard realized that every precaution he had taken was necessary but not sufficient. The scammers were persistent, intelligent, and willing to cross boundaries most people would not dare. And now, he faced a moral and strategic dilemma. How far would he go to protect his neighbors without endangering himself or anyone else? That night, as Jard reviewed the building's camera feeds, he noticed something unsettling: the figures of two men, distant but unmistakable, moving in the shadows near the entrance. They were patient, observing, waiting. He felt the tension tighten in his chest. This was no longer about catching criminals in the act, it was about preventing them from escalating, about staying one step ahead in a game where the rules were constantly shifting. He spent hours mapping out the potential scenarios in his mind, plotting routes of escape, lines of communication, and contingencies for the worst-case outcomes. Every detail mattered: timing, positioning, dialogue, even the smallest gestures. He realized that he had become more than a tenant or a landlord in this narrative. He had become a guardian, a strategist, and an actor in a drama of deception and morality. And then, just as the night reached its deepest hour, Jard noticed a movement in the lobby. A single figure appeared, leaning casually against the wall, observing the cameras. His heart skipped a beat. He could see the faint outline of a hood, the subtle shift of weight. The figure wasn't moving to steal, to scam, or to threaten openly, it was reconnaissance, testing his defenses once again. Jard knew this was the moment he had been preparing for. He activated a prearranged signal, one that the officer had recommended, a discreet alert to law enforcement, a silent notification that escalation was imminent. And then, in the quiet hum of the building, he stepped into the lobby, clipboard in hand, ready to confront the shadow waiting for him. The figure looked up. For a moment, time seemed suspended, as if the entire world had narrowed to a single heartbeat. Jard's eyes met the stranger's, and he saw something there, a flicker of calculation, recognition, and perhaps a hint of fear. The balance had shifted. But even as he prepared to make his move, a new realization struck him. This wasn't just about catching the scammers anymore. It was about revealing the hidden layers of human behavior, the cunning, the deception, the moral choices that separated predator from protector. And in that moment, Jard understood that the story was evolving in ways he had never anticipated. Because somewhere in the shadows, the predators were regrouping, watching, learning, and waiting for the right moment to strike. And Jard, the tenant who had dared to become a landlord in the eyes of danger, was ready to meet them head-on. The game was far from over, and the next confrontation promised to be even more daring, more revealing, and more dangerous than anything he had faced before. The morning light crept into the apartment, but Jard felt no warmth. Sleep had eluded him for nights, replaced instead by a relentless awareness that every shadow might conceal danger. The previous evening's reconnaissance had confirmed his fears. The scammers were adapting. They weren't random opportunists anymore, they were organized, methodical, and patient. Each day brought a new test, a new attempt to probe for weaknesses, and now they were escalating. Jard knew he had to act decisively. He couldn't wait for them to make the next move, he had to take control of the narrative. He devised a bold plan. He would use the dummy apartment as bait once again, but this time with a twist. He would make it appear vulnerable and enticing, a treasure hidden in plain sight, and he would confront the scammers directly, ensuring that the act of deception could be documented fully, leaving no room for doubt. He spent the day preparing. The apartment was staged meticulously: scattered papers suggesting bank deposits, fake invoices implying overdue payments, a small safe visibly tucked under the bed. Every detail was designed to lure the predators, to play on their greed without putting any real resident at risk. Jard even left a note for Mrs. Carmichael, telling her she could remain safe in her own apartment, unaware that her landlord persona was orchestrating a confrontation just a few doors down. By late afternoon, Jard took his position in the shadows, monitoring the dummy apartment through discreet cameras. He felt a strange mix of adrenaline and dread. Part of him hoped the scammers would arrive, but another part dreaded the confrontation. This wasn't just about catching criminals, it was about stepping into danger knowingly, and the stakes had never been higher. As evening fell, the tension in the air thickened. Footsteps echoed outside the building, measured and cautious. Two figures emerged, hooded and careful, moving with the precision of men who had done this many times before. Jared's heart pounded. He adjusted his landlord badge, took a deep breath, and prepared to step into the role fully, knowing the scammers would respond only to authority. The first man approached the dummy apartment, pretending to knock politely. Jared's voice cut through the hall like steel. "Excuse me, stop right there. I need identification before anyone enters." The man froze, eyes darting nervously. His companion hesitated a few steps back, calculating, waiting to see if intimidation would work. Jared held his stance, calm but unyielding. "I know what you're trying to do," he said, voice firm. "This is a private property. Any unauthorized entry will be reported immediately." For a moment, time seemed suspended. The scammers exchanged glances, panic flickering in their eyes. They weren't prepared for a tenant who had transformed into an authority figure who had studied their every tactic and was ready to counter it at every turn. Jared could almost see the gears turning in their heads. They were considering retreat, weighing risk against potential reward. Then, the taller man tried a diversion, speaking quickly and smoothly. "Listen, we're just here for an urgent inspection. Gas leak, a safety hazard, paperwork left by the management office." Jared shook his head slowly, voice calm but cutting. "Your story changes too often. I've been monitoring this building. I know you've lied before. Step back now or I will have law enforcement involved immediately." The men hesitated, then retreated slightly. Jared could sense the subtle shift. They were no longer confident predators, they were intruders faced with an unpredictable force. He decided it was time to escalate carefully. He picked up his phone, pretending to make a call. "I'm contacting the authorities. Any attempt to enter without proper verification will be a legal offense. I suggest you leave immediately." The scammers exchanged a quick, urgent whisper. They glanced at the cameras, at the hallway doors, at every angle of observation. Then, almost simultaneously, they bolted down the street, disappearing into the darkness. Jared stood there, adrenaline coursing through him, feeling a strange mixture of triumph and apprehension. But even as relief washed over him, he knew this wasn't the end. The predators would adapt. They had learned something crucial: the tenant was not to be underestimated, and that realization made them more dangerous. Over the next few days, Jared shifted tactics. He moved beyond simple traps and observation. He began to study patterns of local scam activity, tracking incidents across the city, connecting the dots between unrelated reports, discovering networks that operated in quiet, hidden ways. Each new piece of information painted a clearer picture. These weren't random criminals. They were organized, coordinated, and systematic. In the evenings, Jared would sit with his notes, connecting addresses, phone numbers, aliases, and suspicious behaviors. He created charts, timelines, and maps, turning his apartment into a command center. The lines between reality and role-playing blurred. When neighbors came by to ask about minor issues, Jared would speak with the calm authority of a landlord, all the while thinking several steps ahead, calculating risk and planning the next stage of the operation. Then one evening, a new development emerged. A woman appeared at the building's entrance, claiming to be a prospective tenant for the dummy apartment. Her story was polished, almost rehearsed. She carried a clipboard, glanced around casually, and asked for keys and verification forms. Jared's instincts screamed danger. This was a new strategy, a lure designed to test his vigilance and adaptability. He stepped forward, clipboard in hand, voice calm but firm. "I'm the landlord. That unit isn't available and I need to verify your identity before allowing entry." The woman's smile faltered for a split second, just long enough for Jared to recognize the hesitation. I have all the paperwork with me," she stammered. Jared shook his head slowly. "I need identification, company affiliation, and a contact number, no exceptions." Her expression shifted subtly, almost imperceptibly. She glanced toward the street, then back at Jared, and for a heartbeat their eyes locked. He could see the calculation in her gaze, the moment when a predator evaluates whether their target is vulnerable. Then she smiled, suddenly bright and convincing. "I understand," she said smoothly. "I can wait while you verify everything." Jared maintained his calm demeanor, all the while observing her behavior, her posture, her micro-expressions. He could sense that she was testing him, looking for weakness, gauging how far she could push the encounter. And in that tension-filled moment, he realized a fundamental truth: these predators thrived not just on greed but on the psychological manipulation of fear, trust, and authority. He made a decision. "I'll verify your information now. Please step inside the lobby and I'll make the call to confirm your affiliation." She nodded, maintaining a composed exterior. Jared dialed the prearranged number he had set up, pretending to contact an external office. He spoke in measured tones, carefully recounting her details and emphasizing the importance of verification. All the while, he observed her reactions, noting every micro-expression, every subtle shift in tone or stance. After what felt like an eternity, he hung up, lowering the phone with deliberate slowness. "Thank you for waiting. I'm afraid we cannot allow you access at this time. Please leave." Her eyes narrowed ever so slightly, but she nodded and turned, disappearing down the street. Jard exhaled slowly, the tension in his shoulders easing just slightly. But he knew that she would return or that someone else would. These predators were persistent, adaptive, and ruthless. In the days that followed, Jard continued his dual strategy, observation and intervention. He reinforced the building's security, coordinated with neighbors, and continued to refine his staged traps. Each interaction, each encounter, each subtle test strengthened his understanding of the scammer's behavior, and gradually a pattern emerged. It was then that Jard realized something profound. He wasn't just defending a building or protecting elderly tenants. He was uncovering the hidden mechanics of human deception, the way fear, greed, and manipulation intertwined. And in doing so, he discovered the unexpected power of vigilance, courage, and moral courage. The idea that a single person armed with knowledge and determination could disrupt even the most calculated schemes. One evening, as he reviewed the week's footage, a sudden movement caught his eye. A man approaching the dummy apartment cautiously, looking around as if expecting surveillance. Jard's heart skipped a beat. This was it, the next encounter, the decisive moment. He grabbed his phone, checked the cameras, and prepared to step into the hallway, ready to confront yet another shadow in this unfolding drama. And in that quiet moment, with tension hanging in the air like a storm about to break, Jard understood a simple, unshakable truth. In the battle between predator and protector, vigilance was the only weapon and courage the only armor. Jard's pulse raced as he moved down the hallway toward the dummy apartment. Every step echoed like a drumbeat in the silence, a reminder that the stakes had never been higher. Outside, the night was still, but inside, the tension was palpable, almost suffocating. This was no longer a game of observation, it was confrontation, a test of courage, wit, and moral resolve. He reached the door and peered through the peephole. Two figures lingered, shuffling nervously, eyes darting toward cameras, the locked doors, and the street beyond. They were cautious, aware, but desperate, a dangerous combination. Jard took a deep breath and stepped out of the shadows. His landlord badge glinted under the dim lobby light. "Good evening," he said calmly, clipboard in hand, voice steady but authoritative. "I need to see identification for anyone attempting entry into this building." The taller man froze, then shifted nervously. "Oh, we're just here to inspect the units," he said, voice faltering. Jard held his ground, unwavering. "I've monitored suspicious activity in this building over the past few weeks. I know exactly what you're trying to do. Step back now, or I will call law enforcement immediately." A tense silence followed. The shorter man glanced toward the street, perhaps weighing escape against the risk of exposure. Jard sensed the flicker of fear, the realization that their usual confidence had eroded. He could feel the shift in the air, the subtle recalibration of power. Then, in a move that surprised even Jard, the taller man attempted a psychological play. "We don't want trouble," he said smoothly. "We're just trying to do our job. The management office sent us." Jard shook his head slowly, voice firm. "Your story has changed multiple times. I'm fully aware that you're attempting to defraud my tenants. Any further deception will be documented and submitted to the authorities. I suggest you leave immediately." For a moment, neither party moved. Time seemed suspended, every second stretching into eternity. Jard's heart pounded, but his voice remained calm, a pillar of authority amid uncertainty. Then he spoke again, softer but no less resolute. "There's nowhere to hide. Every action is recorded, every word is noted. You've already underestimated me, and that mistake will cost you if you continue." The men exchanged glances, a silent conversation passing between them. Fear, frustration, and calculation intertwined in a delicate balance. They had never encountered a tenant so prepared, so vigilant, and so fearless. Finally, almost reluctantly, they began to retreat, moving back toward the street. Jard followed slowly, keeping a watchful eye, making sure they didn't attempt anything unexpected. As they disappeared into the darkness, he felt a surge of triumph, but it was tempered with unease. This confrontation had been successful, yes, but it had also confirmed something troubling. These predators were persistent, organized, and adaptable. They wouldn't give up easily. Over the next several days, Jard doubled down on his vigilance. He installed additional security measures, coordinated more closely with neighbors, and even set up a rotation of watchful eyes in the building. Each resident was briefed discreetly on how to recognize suspicious behavior and how to report it safely. Jard was no longer acting alone, the building itself had become an ecosystem of protection. One evening, as he reviewed security footage, he noticed something subtle but alarming. The hooded figures were back, but they weren't approaching the dummy apartment. Instead, they were observing the building from a distance, noting entrances, cameras, and patterns of movement. It was reconnaissance, a calculated assessment of how the building was defended. They were learning, adapting, and preparing for their next move. Jard understood then that he was engaged in a war of wits, a psychological chess match. Every action he took, every precaution he implemented would be met with countermeasures. The stakes were higher than ever, and the consequences of error could be devastating. He began to think several moves ahead. He staged decoy scenarios, fake resident complaints, false maintenance schedules, and misleading signs of vulnerability. Each detail was designed to draw the predators into predictable behavior, allowing Jard to observe and document without putting anyone at risk. And then, one night, the breakthrough came. The hooded figures returned, moving cautiously toward the dummy apartment. This time, however, they were alone. Separated and clearly more nervous. Jard, monitoring from his hidden vantage point, could see every micro-expression, the flicker of hesitation, the tightening of fists, the rapid scanning of surroundings. They had been primed by his previous encounters to expect resistance, but now they were walking straight into the trap. Jard stepped out into the lobby, clipboard in hand, projecting authority and calm. "I've been expecting you," he said softly but firmly. "I suggest you leave immediately. You are trespassing, and I have documented every attempt." The men froze, startled. One glanced nervously toward the cameras, then at the phone in Jard's hand. The tension was palpable, a silent countdown before confrontation. "Call the authorities," the taller man muttered, voice shaking. "We were leaving." Jard's calm demeanor never wavered. "Good choice," he said, "and I suggest you never return." As the men disappeared into the night, Jard allowed himself a moment of relief. For the first time in weeks, the building felt quiet, safe, and under control. But he knew that this victory, though significant, was temporary. The world contained people who thrived on deceit, manipulation, and exploitation. He had won this round, but the battle against predatory behavior was ongoing, a vigilance that demanded constant attention. In the following days, Jard worked to ensure that the elderly residents of the building felt secure. He met personally with Mrs. Carmichael, explaining in gentle terms that the threats they faced had been intercepted. He did not reveal the full extent of his deception, understanding that the knowledge of the staged traps could frighten her unnecessarily. Instead, he focused on reassurance, empathy, and the restoration of a sense of safety. Word of his efforts began to spread quietly. Neighbors who had initially been skeptical or indifferent started to recognize the value of vigilance, communication, and community cohesion. Jard had become more than a tenant. He had become a guardian, a catalyst for awareness, and a subtle force of justice within the microcosm of the building. And yet in the quiet moments, Jard reflected on the moral complexity of his actions. He had assumed the identity of a landlord, engaged in deception, and deliberately manipulated situations to provoke the scammers. The legality of his actions was a gray area, and the ethical implications lingered. But he had acted out of necessity, guided by a higher purpose, protection of the vulnerable. In that, he found moral clarity, even amid lingering questions. Weeks passed, and the building returned to a rhythm of calm. The scammers did not return, at least not immediately. Jard remained vigilant, but the acute tension that had defined the previous month began to dissipate. Residents felt safer, and a sense of quiet community returned. One evening, Jard stood in the lobby, watching the sun set over the quiet street. The light glinted off his clipboard, the cameras, the small badges and signs that had become symbols of his vigilance. In that moment, he understood something profound. Courage was not always about confrontation. Sometimes it was about preparation, observation, and the quiet strength to act when necessary. Mrs. Carmichael approached, offering a small plate of cookies. "You've done more than anyone could have imagined," she said softly. "I don't know how to thank you." Jard smiled, feeling a rare, unburdened peace. "Just take care of yourself," he said. "That's thanks enough." As she walked away, Jard turned back to the lobby, eyes scanning the quiet street outside. The world still held shadows, still held predators, but he had learned something vital. Even in the darkest situations, a single determined person could illuminate the path of protection, courage, and moral action. And while the story of the scammers was, for now, concluded, Jard knew this truth would endure. Vigilance was never a one-time act. It was a mindset, a choice, and a responsibility that defined who we were in the face of unseen danger. The building was quiet, the shadows had receded. But Jard remained watchful, knowing that the line between safety and threat was fragile and that his role as protector, though invisible to most, was never truly complete. And in that quiet vigilance he discovered an unexpected sense of purpose, a realization that one person's courage could change not just the lives of the vulnerable, but the course of unseen stories unfolding in the dark corners of ordinary neighborhoods. Because in the end, it wasn't about catching criminals alone, it was about restoring trust, dignity, and safety to those who needed it most. And for Jard, that mission had only just begun.